it was his lifelong ambition to live in Erets-Yisrael, and he had bought land already in 32, and he went there again in 36, and they were seriously talking about moving. And at some point soon after that, I apparently was on the way. And then the war came, so that delayed their moving to Israel. So even though my grandmother was disabled at that point from a stroke in about 46, they finally did make arrangements and move in January of 49, sailing on the Queen Mary. When he first moved there, they had originally bought property that was fairly high up, midway up on the Carmel, and had a decent view, but by the time they got there in 1949, it had all been built up and there was no view anymore. And eventually they, instead of building a house on their lot, they were offered an apartment in a place that was being built high up on the Carmel, Mount Carmel and Moriah Street, right at the top of the Carmel. And so when they moved there in January, it was not built yet. But eventually, in about March of 1950, they moved into their flat. And their apartment became a gathering place for Jewish intellectuals, and the recently freed Soviet Jewish writers came there. Sutzkever was a frequent visitor. And my grandfather was active and on the board of publication, the Golden Kate. Our first trip abroad was in 1964. We went to various places in Europe and then to Israel for 2 weeks. We actually stayed at the Pinski residence at 91 Moriah on the Carmel. My grandfather had actually purchased it. It wasn't a rental apartment. He actually bought the thing. So there was a question of what will happen afterwards. He had been taken care of by various caretakers who were apparently funded by either the city of Haifa or one of the organizations. But I guess my parents had the feeling that they had invested all this money taking care of him, and there was no will. They didn't really want to claim the apartment for themselves. So eventually, my father had an agreement with the Labor Party and the real estate arm that it should be kept as a memorial meeting house for Jewish intellectuals on the Carmel, a place to gather. So when we went there in 1964, the longtime housekeeper, Golda, was still living in the apartment. Apparently, in Israel, when someone's living there, you can't just get rid of them. They have squatters' rights. So there was a question of having to pay her off to leave the premises. And eventually, my father made an agreement that they should keep the place in perpetuity as a meeting place on the Carmel. And if at some point in the future they couldn't maintain that, then they should find another place nearby to carry out the will. So apparently for a year or two after the agreement was made in 1966. My grandfather died in 59. So with this agreement in 66, it was apparently followed appropriately for a year or two, but eventually his chaverim either died off or and eventually the apparatchiks of the Mapai party came in and essentially liquidated the place and walked off with all the belongings. The next door neighbor with whom we had become friendly from our visit there in '64 and whom we're still in touch with, saw the party people just walking off with paintings and sculptures and books. And that was apparently the end of any sort of memorial for Dovid Pinski. So when we went there late in 1998, we went there due to becoming aware that the Labour Party was trying to get our permission to sell things off, to sell the apartment. Since we hadn't heard anything from them in a long time, we had no idea what was happening at this point with the apartment. When we did get there, we found Weight Watchers signs in the window. Apparently it was rented out to Weight Watchers and apparently an airplane club, and they had political meetings there for campaigning for the Mapai Party, during which droves of people would appear and trample the lawn, much to the consternation of the other residents in the building. So Aviva contacted the judge who was handling this, and he agreed to hear an appeal to delay the sale, the transfer, complete transfer to the city. So this was the beginning of years of litigation, first in local court in Haifa. We appeared repeatedly, starting in 1999, for court appearances against Beit Al-Lazarov, which was the real estate arm of the Labour, of the Mapai Party. And the opponent said, well, where were you all these years? This was the agreement was in '66, and here we were appearing in '99. Where were you all these years? Didn't you know what was going on? So you hadn't been here all these years. So we said, well, we had changed careers, we had children, we just didn't travel anywhere. And not that we went to Europe and didn't go to Israel, we just hadn't traveled any place. So, and we had a succession of lawyers, the first of whom was a Ganef, and eventually there was a decision against us. Then we had an appeal which went to the Israeli Supreme Court. So we actually appeared at the Supreme Court. And the eventual decision was that the party hadn't done the right thing. They were remiss in not fulfilling the terms of the agreement, but there was some complicated thing of a gift versus a donation. There was some technical thing, and so they weren't going to reverse the decision not to return the apartment to us. So the good part of this was that we hadn't been to Israel since 1964 before that, and this started a series of like 10 trips back and forth between then and 2008 when the Supreme Court appearance took place. So with all those visits, we became familiar with Israel. We used to rent a car and drive all over, and so whatever it cost us to pursue the case, at least there were benefits of becoming familiar with Israel.